We're going to have a few more people trickling in here during the intro, I'm sure. Good evening, everybody. I'm Nick Dembowski. I'm the president of the Kingsbridge Historical Society and the director of the Van Cortlandt House Museum. Welcome. We're pleased you could join us for a joint presentation about Pinkster, the country's oldest documented African-American celebration. And I'm very pleased to introduce to you our presenter, Lavada Nahon, the interpreter of African-American history for New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. She's worked at so many historic sites in our area, but I want to mention in particular the excellent work she's done as the project lead at reinterpreting the Phillips Manor Hall State Historic Site in Yonkers. If you have not seen it, you really need to. If you should have a question during this presentation, please send a message to me directly. We'll have time at the end for questions. And every time I get a chance to talk to Lavada, I learn something new. So I'm very excited to have an extended presentation from you, and take her away.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, everyone, for coming this evening. And I hope you can hear me because I realized I left my headphones at home, at the office. I thought we'd start this overall presentation really is just to give you a founding about Pinkster. What is Pinkster? Where did it come from? And how does it play out in New York history? So this is a very big overview. So if you do have any questions, I do encourage you to put them in the chat to Nick so we can have a nice discussion when we're done. So getting to know New York African and African descendant history. Pinkster. So let's see, it's not letting me, oh, there we go. So what is Pinkster? So we're going to break that down to a few things. There's the word and day, time of year, and the celebration itself. The word and day. Pinkster is a shortened version of the Dutch word Pinkersten. It means Pentecost. Now, what is Pentecost? For those of the British Church or the Church of England who were also called Anglican or Episcopalian, if you maintain the Christian calendar at all, you either know it as Pentecost or you know it as Whit Sunday. Pentecost is the second major feast of the Christian year. It takes place 50 days after Easter, and it celebrates the resurrected Jesus departing and his gift of the Holy Spirit to the apostles. And it is the beginning of their ministry. It really is the beginning of the Christian church. Remember, at Easter, Jesus has resurrected, he returns to the earth, and then for that 50 days, he is walking the earth, meeting people, converting people, encouraging his apostles, and then he departs. And when a few days later, they're in the upper room, we have the apostles then getting the gift of the Holy Spirit, where they throw up the windows of the upper room and they begin speaking in a variety of languages. And the people who are in Jerusalem, who are actually there for the Feast of the First Fruits. So it is a holy season on the Jewish calendar as well. And if you want to know the full story, you can find that in the Acts of the Apostles, the New Testament, Acts of the Apostles, chapters 1 and 2. There are several calendars that people during the colonial period live the rhythms of their lives. We tend now to live on the Gregorian calendar. It is the everyday calendar that we use, but it is during the 18th century that we actually moved from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar. And for this overview, that doesn't really make a difference. It really is about how much time is added over hundreds of years. So they both have leap years and all of that. And then overlaying the regular day-to-day calendar are religious calendars. And every faith tradition from those of the book to indigenous to others, have some kind of calendar of feast and fast days or ceremonial days and periods of time. Some of those are lunar, some of those are solar, and some of those dates on that calendar are particular to that one religion. Then we have the agricultural calendar, the hemispheres, house the seasons of the year when grounds are prepared for plowing, when things are planted and grown and harvested and preserved. So those rhythms of life play a big part of actually what goes on with Pinkster. Now, Pinkster affects these three calendars. It is religious, of course, it's Pentecost. And that time, 50 days after Easter, usually falls somewhere between mid to late May or early June. This year is considered early, and in this year, it's May 28th. It's the Sunday of Memorial Day weekend. Then we have the agricultural calendar, the season. Both here in New Netherland, New York, and in Europe, our seasons are pretty in sync. And so that puts us at a time where our cash crop, once we go from a fur trading colony, the cash crop becomes wheat. In our area, that dominant wheat is the winter variety, which means it is sown in the ground in the fall. It lays in the ground under the snow all through the winter. That spring snow waters those seeds, and then in early spring, it starts to grow. It grows very quickly in the summer. It's harvested late summer. It's milled in the fall, and then that process starts all over again. Peas are pretty much the only crop that is sown during that early spring period that we're in now. We are definitely seeing climate change, but remember, when we're in the 17th, early 18th century, we're at we've come out of that little ice age. So the ground could still be very cold. So peas are planted, and peas are a field crop. They're not just a few things in a kitchen garden. In our area in New York, peas are a field crop, and they're like acres and acres and acres. But most other crops, most of the fruits and vegetables will not start to appear until mid-June or later. So there's limited agricultural work during this time. And we also now have the shipping lanes that are starting to open. That seasonal calendar, I don't know if you've been out and about, but these last few days of things warming up, even now, there are only 2 times of the year that the enslaved get significant rest time. One is in spring for Pinkster, and that climate allows for people to move, allows for people to travel. But the other time of the year is either going to be New Year's or 12th night, and that is cold, it's snowy, people don't travel, they can't sleep outside. It's a very hazardous time. It is during this season in the winter where the wheel, everyone is going up and down in their sleighs. We have so many historic documents talking about that. So they're not doing that foot travel. They're not on the waters. The Hudson is freezing. The estuaries are freezing. So this is really important. And another thing that is very important to remember as we talk about Pinkster overall and the people who are gathering, please do remember, not everyone gets time off. If you are hosting, then your household is hosting, then you have to stay, right? So what happens during Pinkster from the Dutch standpoint? Just like most large celebrations, people are gathering. Sunday is a very religious day, so people are in church that day. After church services, people go visiting their families, they travel, and that's the same thing that we do now, right? We travel for Easter, we travel for Thanksgiving, we may be traveling for Christmas. But in New York and this region, if you are a Christian, you are in church. And then you will go and do your visiting. Now, why is Pinkster important to the enslaved Africans? Religions and culture. One of the things that a lot of people are not aware of is that a lot of the enslaved, particularly coming out of the Congo into our area, the Congo and Angola, were probably Christian or had been exposed to Christianity before they arrived here. The Portuguese arrived, went up the Congo River in 1483. That is at least 150 to 200 years before we start to see the real push of the transatlantic slave trade. On the heels of the Portuguese, once we get into the early 16th century, will be the Dutch. But even in that period of first contact, the king of the Congo converts to Christianity. So from that point forward, for several hundred years, the kings of Congo are Christian. And they have a relationship of equality, particularly in the first 100 years or so, 150 years or so of this relationship with Portugal. Portugal, once the ships start coming in, they are also then bringing in priests. One thing that always amazes me, and I love this quote, no state on the Atlantic coast of Africa is more fully documented before the 19th century than the Kingdom of Congo. Its elite become literate within a few years of contact with Portugal. They leave a thin but invaluable thread of Congo documentation, and its conversion of Christianity brought in missionaries who documented nearly every aspect of Congo life in remarkable detail, right? So again, the Portuguese go in there first, but then, as you know, they developed the caravel, which was an ocean-going vessel. They also learned how to deal with the trade winds and the currents around Africa that allowed them not only to go to Africa, but actually to leave Africa. And once they conquered that, they had trade with Congo and all up and down the West Coast, but predominantly with the Kingdom of Congo. The Congolese, of the books, of the religions of the book, the Christianity is the most flexible. Islam is very rigid, Judaism is very rigid, but wherever Christianity goes, if you study Christian history, elements of indigenous or what we call pagan cultures remain within those traditions. Many of us are aware that even the dominant feast days really are based on a lot of Roman and Greek pagan days, right? So we have this mixture that's happening in Congo, even though they're trying to push Christianity. Traditional African practices, Congolese religion remains. The enslaved out of Angola and Congo, and Angola is heavily impacted by Congo. It's in that same area, and the Kingdom of Congo is expanding. And so that's why a lot of the initial enslaved in the trade are actually from Angola. And Angola will have more, contribute more people to the transatlantic slave trade throughout that whole period of the trade than any other region of Africa. And so it is the people from Angola and the people from Congo, they are bringing both of these traditions here. We're finding archaeological evidence in New York from the digs done, way back in the early 20th, mid 20th century, even to digs that are being done now. We're finding that mixture of both Christianity and Congo religious practices. And as we go further north, we're also starting to find a lot of Yoruba religious material being left. But most importantly, from my perspective, Pinkster gives them an opportunity to see the people they love, people they care about, people like themselves. It is a period, Pinkster represents a period of full humanity for the Africans and their descendants that are held in bondage here in the colony and in the new state. It is a time where they have laughter, they have joy, they have happiness, they have cultural, religious, and communal freedom. And for me, this area is very important. One of the things I think as a culture we continue to do is to dehumanize the enslaved. And we do that by only focusing on their pain, only focusing on the punishments. We keep them chained to the bottom of the boats. We keep them in collars and broken on the wheel. We know all of those things happen, but we also know they loved, they married, they were distraught when their children were taken away. So this gives them an opportunity to be able to see people again who are important in their lives. Pinkster gatherings happened basically all over the colony, particularly in the areas that are dominated by the Dutch. We think of New York now with all of our various counties, but there weren't that many, right? So there was Suffolk County, New York County, Kings County, Richmond County, Queens County, Westchester, Dutchess, Orange, Ulster, and Albany. And then over time, we'll expand. But as you can see here, in 1775, the counties are very, very big. And the areas that people are bound in are rather geographically rather large. So just to give an overview of populations, and at this point, we're in the mid 18th century, in the mid 1700s. So out on Long Island, Suffolk County, it is 10% of the populace, right? So that's about 1,000 to 1,500 people that are enslaved out there. And this is not including the free Africans or African descendants that we will find. Queens County, we're about 20% or around 2,000 people. Kings County has the largest percentage of enslaved, but the European community in Kings County is small, right? So they're at 30%. So that proportion is a little off. There are actually only about 2,000 people there, but again, it's because the European population is smaller. In New York, by the mid 1740s, we have over 2,000 enslaved Africans. But by 1771, we are over 3,000 people enslaved in New York City. But this is what always throws everyone off. Albany County had the largest slave population in the Hudson River Valley. And after mid-century, the largest slave population in the entire province. By the early 1770s, almost 4,000 African Americans inhabited this northern jurisdiction. And that's a quote from David Gelman out of Emancipating New York. One of the challenges we have, even as we just speak of enslaved history overall, because we're so Manhattan focused, we're so New York City focused, everyone looks strongly at what's going on in New York City, and we forget about Albany. We forget that the first 11 who were purchased by the Dutch West India Company and enslaved, that did not happen in New Amsterdam. New Amsterdam didn't even exist then. It actually happened north, up around Albany, in what was then Fort Orange. So because the population of Europeans in Albany County, in Rensselaerwyck, the manor of Rensselaerwyck, is so large, the population of enslaved becomes small. So one of the things as you speak about where the people are in the county, or you think about where the people are in a province, I really do encourage you sometimes just to look at straight population numbers. Don't always get caught up in the percentage. So, because that throws the body to body count off. So we have, I always feel that whatever information we have is a lot around anything. But in terms of the high level of sources, we could have more, but we're still finding a lot of resources around or references to Pinkster. But our earliest is a very indirect reference, and it's actually from Anne Grant's Memoirs of an American Lady. Now, Anne Grant, when she's a grown woman, she retires and returns to Scotland. But in her early life, she, as a young girl, she spent a number of years with the Schuylers in Albany. And her memoirs give us a lot of detail about what was going on in Albany. And as a young girl, she remembers that the licentious and idle habits, right? And she says 3 stated periods in the year when for a few days, young and old, masters and slaves were abandoned by unruly enjoyment and neglected every serious occupation for pursuits of this nature, right? So those 3 periods of the year, we have then them to be Pinkster, New Year's Day, 12th night, or we have them, another possibility would be Easter, but most people are leaning towards Pinkster being that late spring celebration, and we have other references that then back that up. The first explicit reference we have to enslaved Africans and Pinkster is actually from Alexander Coventry in 1786. He's a Scottish medical doctor. He's living in the Hudson Valley. And in his journal, he says, "It is all frolicking today with the Dutch and the Negro. This is a holy day, Whit Sunday, called among the Dutch Pinkster." And 2 days later, in his journal, he notes, "Still frolicking and dancing for Pinkster," right? We have references for large celebrations that happened in New York City, like Catherine's Market and a couple of the other markets. We have references that it happened on Long Island, in the Hudson River Valley, in Albany, and in New Jersey. Now, in a fluke, one of my colleagues, Travis Bowman, the head of the curatorial and collections for the Parks Department, decided to look for other spellings of Pinkster. So this, he found 2 notices actually by doing this, and this one came up in, he found this in April of 2020. It was in the Troy Daily News, and in this case, Pinkster, right, is spelled Pinkster, Pingster. But this article says the Dutch residents retained many of the old customs of their motherland, and no reminiscence of Holland was more earnestly kept in remembrance than Pinkster. This occasion, by consent, had been made a holiday time for Blacks, and they enjoyed it in a good old-fashioned measure of hilarity and carousing. The meadow in front of Colonel Schuyler's house, between it and the river, was the place usually selected for the celebration. And there they met and danced and frolicked. Occasionally, they would go to Albany and aid their neighbors in drinking to Prince Charlie, but this was too often a hard day's work and did not always pay for the trouble it cost in rowing down and back. Now, the Schuyler family is really large, and we often are aware of Schuyler Manor in Albany, but we also have Schuyler Flats, and that is about 30 miles north of Albany. And so they would have had to row, after working and tired, they would have to deal with the current on the Hudson. because the Hudson is the major roadway, of course, getting up and down and through from Albany up and going north, or even going down towards New York City. He also, I just want to mention, in that same day of doing that research, found a runaway ad where a gentleman had been given permission to attend Pinkster in Albany and then ran away. He didn't go back, because that's one of the unusual things about this period of time. The enslaved are allowed to travel without passes. So they're given time to travel, to be at a Pinkster gathering, and then to get back to their locations. The oldest description we have is actually really, really detailed. And we do have other descriptions that show up in journals and letters and diaries. We have a couple of newspaper accounts and things like that, but people are anonymous. That's one of the frustrating parts about it. I guess they don't want to admit that they were hanging out with the Blacks. So they all end up being these anonymous sources. But in print, one of the things that AB does, and he tells us a lot of detail around how it's set up, how the grounds are set up, how the days are spent, and all of that. And so we learn that the African American community, for me, it's the African descendant community, usually begins its preparation a week before the holiday, right? The Negroes patrol the streets from evening more than usual and begin to participate a little and practice upon the guinea drum. Now, in this case, guinea refers to, it's a term that's used from anywhere from West Africa down to Angola. The event happened, we know from this and a few other references, that it happened on Pinkster Hill, which was along the Great Western Road near the cemetery and the gallows. Now, Pinkster Hill is actually the high point here in Albany. It's actually 5 blocks from where I am currently sitting. It is where our Capitol sits. And 3 blocks north of the Capitol, there is a patch of land that has never been developed, but also is not marked. But apparently it is known that that is a Black burial ground. So they, in setting up this area for Pinkster, they set up a type of amphitheater, and around that they have arbors or booths of different sizes and figures. And then there's a game area. And then there's the camping of the populace on the greater outside of this. And AB described, I love this description that he uses, that the whole scenery at a distance, especially when the wind puts the shrubbery texture of these airy cottages in motion, assumes the appearance not of art, but nature, and forms a beautiful contrast with the forbidding nakedness of the surrounding hills. Now, if you have come to Albany, or just in case you haven't, from the Hudson River, it is straight uphill. It is a series of gradual hills that don't plateau for a good 10 blocks from where I am. It is always wonderful to ride my bike downhill, but it is very hard to turn around and get back uphill. But in the development of Albany, it started at the riverfront. So where the Capitol is sitting now was unwanted land. But over time, as the town spread, it took up then Pinkster Hill. Now, there are elements of the Pinkster celebration that we hear repeatedly and see repeated throughout a lot of the references we have. We have the guinea drums, we have fiddles, we have mouth harps and other instruments of the moment. Now, drums aren't most of us grew up thinking that drums were outlawed, right? With the Stono Rebellion, they're gone, they're not played at all. We're not finding in archaeological digs, in the material culture in our area, a lot of intact drums. But drums, according to Chief Bobanil Clark, who is a drum scholar and a master drummer and a known jazz drummer, it's easy to make a drum, right? You make something temporary. You take, we have one reference where it's made from an eel pot. So a skin is stretched over this eel pot, is used, and then it's taken apart and it goes back to its function. The only instrument that we note, the two instruments that come up a lot in relationship with enslaved men, particularly, are fiddles. We have runaway ads, we have letters, we have so many references to fiddles. And I was on a call with an archaeologist who is doing a dig, and this happened last week. And she's up in on Great Island at Beaver River State Park. And in that dig, she's looking at what she believes may have been a maroon community. And one of the things she found was amongst artifacts related to known artifact types that were related to Africans was a tuning key for a fiddle. So I love that. That immediately, for me, solidified that. We know that there was a lot of dancing. We also know that they had processions, and those processions are linked to Catholic brotherhoods. Remember, in Congo, it was Roman Catholics, and they still, you will see this throughout Portugal, you will see this throughout Italy and Spain, where at different times of the year, they take a particular saint and they parade them through the streets, right? So during this time, you see those brotherhoods maintaining that. It is the brotherhood organizations here we have coming out of the Black religious tradition in the colony and the new state that even will be existing in the African AME, African Methodist Episcopal, African Methodist Episcopal Zion, the Baptist tradition. Those will become the organizations that support the newly freed. They're the ones who then become the charity organizations. They're so those organizations are well in play even during the period of enslavement. And in this case, the king and his court, one of the most documented men related to being a Pinkster king is a man enslaved here in Albany named Charlie. And King Charlie, he's called Prince Charlie early, and later he's called King Charlie, supposedly came from African royalty. And that's one of the things I think also a lot of people are not aware of. Throughout Africa, you have kings. You know, we have chiefs, we have kings. So that whole concept of royalty and someone who speaks and represents the community is elected. Sometimes the king is a master drummer in Pinkster celebrations, and sometimes he's not. He's just a well-respected elder within the community. We have revelers, you know, people are there to have a good time. We have people playing games. There's always a marketplace. There's a lot of selling of goods that happen around Pinkster. And even in Hooper Fenimore's book, Satan's Toe, he talks about people selling buttermilk and other goods. And AB in his references talks about people selling goods. So whatever they've been able to make, if they have extra food or whatever, they're doing that. And then so you also have the enjoyment and the pleasure and the renewal of spirit. So that's all happening. Now, what happens to Pinkster, right? So we have these documented all the way until we get really into what we are early 19th century, that new nation period, right? Albany is expanding. And it's banned here in Albany. And one of the reasons they say is that there's so many people. There are all these thousands of people showing up, and the populace is fearful, but the city is also expanding. So there's a question of, did they ban it because they wanted the land? But we do know that there is a worry that suddenly you have this free population. At this time, we're going towards gradual manumission here in New York. Our 200th anniversary is shortly. So during this period from 1799 to 1827, slavery is still legal in New York, but people are being heavily encouraged to individually manumit their enslaved. So to manumit means that you free an enslaved person when slavery is still the law of the land. So that's the difference between emancipation and manumission. So we have this growing free Black population, and they're gaining in power and they're gaining in presence. And for this period of time, it becomes a real concern. Then we also have this overlay of democracy happening. And so we have election days coming up. We have federal celebrations like July 4th is starting to happen. We also then have the disbursement of the free population, particularly in the southern part of the state around Manhattan, Long Island, Staten Island, and Jersey. The immigrant populations are coming in and they're displacing the free population who have been connected to this Dutch culture, whose ancestors probably spoke Dutch. So that is also starting to shift people. What happens is that we are now having people opening up central New York, Western New York, people are moving up. But even as we open during this period, the Erie Canal, up around the Mohawk River in the central western part of the state, there's a Black flight. So all during this time, we also then have the beginning of the Underground Railroad period. So then we have this slow but steady impact of Southern history, Southern traditions coming and overlaying the Dutch traditions that are happening here. We lost it to history because there's also a very large dismissal of our Dutch beginnings. And a lot of that is because of the Dutch language, right? People can't read those early documents. The Dutch themselves consider New Netherland a failed experiment. So there's a dismissal. A lot of the reclaiming of Pinkster, a lot of the reclaiming of our Dutch beginnings really is based on historic research that is less than 40 years old. Again, I cannot give enough shout out to Dr. Charles Gehring for his intense life's work of translating literally thousands of documents out of Old Dutch into English, that we now have a greater access to those documents of what was happening here. And while he has been doing that work, that research has also been expanded in the Netherlands. So now we know far more about New Netherland and about the Dutch presence than ever. But one of the things, even in her narrative, Sojourner Truth talks about wanting to go back and celebrate Pinkster. And as we all know, her first language was Dutch. And the worst beating she ever got was she was about a girl about 10 years old because she had been sold to people who spoke English and didn't speak Dutch, and they couldn't communicate. They weren't communicating well. And we have references to people speaking Dutch all over Ulster County, out in Staten Island, up here in Albany, well into the mid-19th century, before Dutch really dies out, particularly within the Black community, because so many of the Dutch families held enslaved Africans. So As I said, this was just an overview. So where do you go learn more about Pinkster? These are some of the references that I have used and mentioned. One of the, if you're in our area, you know, one of the challenges is we don't have enough books. We're still too deep in the document phase. Long hammering, Professor A.J. Williams Myers, one of our elders, who is now an ancestor, has one of the earliest printed chapters on Pinkster in his book, Long Hammering. One of the more recent, and I love this book because it really brings in the whole religious background and the placement of Dutch culture and Congolese culture within the Dutch environment, not only here in New Netherland, New York, but also in Brazil, and in Curacao and other places in Barbados where the Dutch had control. So that would be The Pinkster King and the King of Congo by Jerome Wolfe. Several years ago, the Metropolitan Museum of Art did an amazing exhibit, bringing out those artifact letters, like from the King of Congo, beautiful calligraphy work. I wish I had that handwriting. To the King of Portugal and his letters back to him, his letters to Rome, because the kings actually sent men from the Congo to Portugal to study to become priests, to Rome to study to become priests, and then they came back. So in that literateness, translated a lot of Catholic documents and Catholic religious catechisms and things into Congolese, so that the people could read them and understand them. So this is just a real overview. Congo Power and Majesty is a wonderful overview of Congolese culture. And then the last book that I recommended, Festivals of Freedom, really are more around emancipation celebrations. But in his book, Mitch described, he has a very little bit on Pinkster, but he talks about that growing presence of things like election days and emancipation days taking over the place that Pinkster had. So I'm sure everyone has a lot of questions. So I'm gonna stop sharing and we'll go from there.
Thanks so much, Lavada. I truly learned a ton from that. I will say, if you ever come across a document referring to Pinkster in Yonkers or area, you definitely need to let us know.
I will.
On that note, I have a question for you, which is, that you and I and the Van Cortlandt Park Alliance were working on a Pinkster celebration in Van Cortlandt Park at the Van Cortlandt House Museum. And, I anticipate getting a question that goes something like this, which is that, the Van Cortlandt estate, which they referred to as their Yonkers plantation, was a place where, people's basic human rights were denied, where families were torn apart, where people were exploited for their labor. And so how in the world is it appropriate to have some kind of celebration there?
Yeah, I've had that question. I celebrate because they celebrate it. And this really is the key to me about how we can, without thinking, dehumanize the enslaved. When we do not allow them to have full lives. If we lived always in a state of pain and a state of persecution, we would have references for thousands of crazy Black folks running around the colony. And we don't have that. We don't have that. But our insistence of not acknowledging their full humanity and their allowance of that full range of human emotions, the range of personal pride in their work, the joy of just being alive. has resulted in books that we need being taken off the market because illustrations showed enslaved people smiling. But one of the things too that's really important to, and this goes to the Congolese part of the religion. The Dakinga represents the 4 positions of the sun, but it is the 4 positions of the soul. It is birth, life, death, rebirth. African traditional religions believe in reincarnation. They also believe that there are things that can take you off the wheel, that you will not be given the right to reincarnate, to become an ancestor again, right? That ancestor veneration is not just for those that are dead. There's this belief that the soul comes back, returns to the family, helps the family grow, helps the family to prosper. So to do ill is to take yourself off that wheel. We have a lot to study and learn and appreciate about African culture because it has been so dismissed that we keep people locked in places that they did not always live in. And I'm not saying that they weren't whipped. I'm not saying that they were not broken on the wheels. We have the references. I read that stuff every day. But I also read like runaway ads that speak to, oh, this person left, but he's probably going over to this farm because that's where his wife is. Or he's probably going here because he's got family there. We have to allow for that love. We have to allow for the depth and placement of spiritual practices, religious practices in people's lives. We have chosen to become very secular, and we will accept spiritualism, right? You know, you can be spiritual, you can be universalist, but people need to understand that people were religious, and religious means practices, daily practices, keeping the church calendars, marking that time. Right? We're in Ramadan now. That's what a religious practice is. So they are both, but they are also full humans. And sorry to go off. That's one of the
Oh,
things
that's perfect.
just really, I just wish that we would just be more attentive to that as individuals.
Mm-hmm. You know, one other thing you mentioned that I found really interesting was references to Angola, Yoruba, Congo. You know, the umbrella term African is so big, you know.
It's so wrong.
So, I mean, because it contains, you know, what is it wrong to say hundreds of cultures? And so, you know, how did that play out in a place like New York where you have, you know, I wouldn't imagine, you know, in Africa, there was much opportunity for a person from Angola to meet someone from Madagascar. But
No,
that was happening here in New York.
yes, it was. And we have that because now we can document. We have so many databases that tell us exactly where the ships came from. And even though they may have left from a coastline, we know that people from in what is now Nigeria area are not going to wander down thousands of miles to the Congo to go from there, right? So we can pretty much say in what areas, and it's documented in the trade books where people were coming from. So what we have here are a lot of different African languages, which to me around Pentecost is wonderful, right? Because you hear all of these different languages, and that's one of the things that AB speaks about in his description is the different African tongues that one hears. But you also hear a lot of Dutch. We import directly from Africa for a long time, but we also are heavily held within Dutch households.
We're getting some compliments here in the chat. And feel free, if you have a question, to send that to me directly. Let's see. We have a very specific question about something you mentioned earlier about the Julian and Gregorian calendar.
Yes.
I wonder if you happen to know what prompted the change from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar.
Okay, let me see if I can get this right. They're both 365 days. They both have leap years. But the way the Julian calendar is structured, you gain 0.25 day of a 1/4 of a day every leap year. So you end up adding too many days to a year over a length of time. And the Gregorian calendar doesn't do that. There's some great comparisons, but this is one of the things that's very interesting in reading documents that show up around the 1751, 1752 switch, is that you see that happening in the documents. You see people adjusting to that change.
Well, because they'll list a date in both calendars.
Yes, yeah, it will. So it's really fun to read things from that period.
So I'm not seeing any more questions here, Lavada. So I think that's it for the evening. Some thank yous coming in, and what was this here? This is an excellent presentation. Thank you. Looking forward to that.
Well, I hope to see everyone at Van Cortlandt House at Pinkster.
May 6th, the Van Cortlandt Park Alliance, the Kingsbridge Historical Society, Van Cortlandt House Museum. You'll get to ask Lavada any question you want over by the camp, and we'll have.
Yes, I'll be playing Mancala, so if you're gonna ask me, you gotta play.
And Chief Baba Neil Clark will be there with the Pinkster players, and there'll be music. There'll be African food from Voila Afrique. There will be hopefully our local Kingsbridge African craft store, Masidi, will be there. So it'll be a great thing. I hope everyone can make it. May 6th.
Thank you all so very much.
Thanks, Lavada. Good night.
Night.